as we record this, a couple of days ago, it was announced on the news that the United States and Israel have bombed Iran, and a number of leaders of the Iranian government and government slash religious organization or whatever are no longer with us, and that has proved to not be quite the popular decision that I think the people that were putting this all together thought it would be. And ideally, in a perfect world, by the time this episode finally hits, things would have settled down and gotten back to normal and everything. But this is one particular case where I can say I highly doubt it. This is one to where this has to be his absolute biggest, stupidest, dumbest mistake ever.
Man, and then people that have already found those old tweets from him where he was like, watch what was it about Obama, I think, was like, now that his numbers are tanking, watch him start a war, like bombing this place, or Iran. And people are doing the strikeout and replacing Obama with, now that my poll numbers are are tanking, watch me as I do this. Gosh, yeah, no, it's it's a little hard to digest. And then of course everybody's going to react slash heel dig slash do what they do in response to all of this, because remember, this was the guy who said we're not going to go to war randomly anymore, right? That was part of his whole thing. This is where MAGA has started actually becoming upset with him, because this was the stuff that he said we shouldn't be doing, and he's doing the thing, and it's getting harder for some people to ignore, to the sense of maybe it's playing an identity threat for once in our benefit, right? That they maybe identify more with not wanting these types of wars than they do their political identity, right? So I don't know. It's stuff that's still playing out right now, obviously. So it's interesting to take in. It's a weird time that we're in right now, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting you mentioned how his crowd are coming out against it. You do have that noted, wonderful human being, Nick Fuentes, who's a far right d-bag with actual Nazi leanings. Came
Yeah.
out and essentially ripped Trump a new one and endorsed for his crowd that in 2026 and 2028 either sit out the elections or vote Democrat. Coming from a far right person. And then you have Marjorie Taylor Greene coming out with some blistering tweets against Trump. And, the skeptic in me is, once again, when it comes to her, I think this pivot from her is more calculated than it is some sort of realization that, oh no, everything I've thought to this point is wrong. I think she realizes that the Trump thing is sinking, but she still wants to be in the public domain. I think she's angling for a 2028 presidential spot. But again, as I've said on the show many times before, and you just alluded to it, if it takes people like her to get the average citizen out there to help stop this madness by voting in some people that are actually going to do proper work in there, then bring it on, Marjorie. Bring it on.
Right. May it be genuine or perhaps PR, right? Because it feels like the spin and the turnaround on these are going to be driven by one of those two things, most likely. But it's well, if the net effect, though, is giving people that social permission to maybe change their mind on how they planned on voting, I'm okay with this, right? Because no matter what, something's got to change, and it can't be allowing this to continue. And it's funny because more and more people are talking about it, right? We don't really dive too much into politics on the show, but yet nobody seems to be able, rightfully so, to ignore this right now. Even last podcast on the left has been more political. Henry himself, like, I make it no secret that I listen to that more. But Henry himself was saying, it's like, I'm not used to following the news. Like, that's not what he does. But yet, like, now with like between the Epstein files and all of this shit going down, like, nobody can ignore it. And it's a good thing, though, I think, because I don't think at this point it is being overly political. I think it's being rightfully political because it's saying, like, no, there's a lot of shit going on to the point that other countries are noticing.
Noticing to the point to where they're questioning whether they want to have interactions with the United States in general. I mean, already having like the EU, for instance, with the whole tariff thing, suspending like potential like trade deals or stuff like that with the United States, like the like when he was elected in 2024. I know that these specific things like the tariffs, like Iran and the other stuff would happen. I didn't know the specifics, but I knew that he was going to be so ignorantly drunk on power that he thought he was going to be able to do absolutely everything he wanted with zero pushback.
Right.
And he has been proven hilariously wrong up to that point. But he's also becoming more and more like a caged animal. And, 2026 coming up and some of the rumblings in the press about potential plans his administration want to put into place to nationalize elections, that should scare a lot of people. That should, because I think when it comes to the politics thing, like one thing that we don't want to do here is kind of sensationalize turning into everything into politics like it is in other media, like turning the Super Bowl halftime show into a political stunt, which it was not. But you can't ignore politics either. It's like we don't want to continuously talk about politics here, but this is something that needs to be talked about. It's like I hope our goal here should be to use our voices responsibly, and using it responsibly in this case is just pointing out how stupid and reckless this is. It would have been stupid and reckless if the same exact thing was done by Joe Biden or Barack Obama. I think we as the American people should go out of our way to continue to call out bad behavior by these politicians, no matter what their political standings are. Because like, should a politician's family be benefiting financially from their political family member in Congress, in power? No, they should not. Whether it's a $200,000 deal or a $2 billion deal, that needs to be called out.
Yeah, and there's real changes going on too, right? I actually, well, while you were doing that, I confirmed today, the day we're recording, is the primary election day in Texas right now. And yeah, live happening is there's been a historic turnout for early slash Democratic leaning voting. So by the time we're done processing what we record today, Tim, there could be something going on in Texas right now. So that's the timing of this. I just remembered seeing something about it. And I actually, I can't think of the last time I donated money to any politician, but I realized, like, wait a second, I can't go and vote in Texas anymore. But I can definitely give $10 to the dude that they wanted to cut, like, the interview with. Who was it? Was it Jon Stewart? Tallarico for Texas, basically.
Stephen
So
Colbert.
Stephen Colbert, thank you. So Colbert had done, and he would have had to have given like equal time or whatever. So he just like aired it on YouTube. So that guy, I opted to be like, hey, I can't go there and vote for you, but I can totally do a one-time donation. So you can actually help in that effect. I was like, oh, hey, yeah, I don't actually have to be, which is interesting when you think about it, that you don't have to be registered to vote somewhere to give money to somebody's campaign. It was just something that never crossed my mind before. That, if I have $5, I can skip a few coffees for me personally and do that if I wanted to. You know what I mean? So yeah, interesting times right now. So that's playing out today. That'll be exciting. Now I get to maybe listen to that in the background of playing with the baby Reverend at the park later.
Yeah, and with the whole Tallarico on Colbert thing, I think a lot of that was Colbert intentionally stoking the fires because the equal time provision, if you think about it in a primary, only means that the other candidates in the primary should get equal time as well. So, and Jasmine Crockett has already been on the Colbert Show before, for whatever reason. So, interesting stuff. And then, of course, there's that congressman in Texas. I don't know if you've heard about it, but apparently he started a extramarital affair relationship with a staffer, and then that staffer, her marriage because of that ended up falling apart, and then sadly she ended up taking her own life, but this guy is still in power, and you have a number of people that are calling for his resignation. But if he resigns today, that would put essentially the House of Representatives at like even standing numbers wise. They only have a one vote majority at this particular time, and it would be even at that particular time. So, of course, you have the Republicans, of course, not doing anything about this particular person. When you would think this is the type of person that, regardless of political standing, you would not want in a position of power, especially with how the woman in question's life ended. It was horrific.
Yeah. Well, and it goes back to, but these are the family values candidates. I
Yeah.
really, it's interesting to me. And again, that was part of like what broke me away from being raised in houses that voted a certain way. I'll put it that way, right? Just watched a lot of one certain news network that has little to do with actual foxes. But anyway, so yeah, it's interesting times. And I'm glad, and I think more people should talk about it because to the point of like other countries noticing what's going on, I think if we honestly act like we're not seeing what's going on, that kind of looks weirder on us, right? But if more people are talking about it, then obviously we're not in agreement and are down to not continue this trajectory, right? So as much as we can flag that, I'm okay with kind of flagging that.
Well, look at that. Our friends are here. Welcome, everybody, to Friends Talking Nerdy. This is Tim the Nerd, and joining me all the way in Washington State, we have the Reverend Tracy. And continuing on with History Month, we have one heck of an interesting topic here. Tell us about it, Reverend.
So this is one of my personal nerdy things, guys. We all know the Reverend Tracy really likes psychology, right? So I wanted to do an episode talking about the history of psychology because there's a saying that goes around, and I hear it a lot, and it always bothers me every time I hear it. And it's this idea that psychology is in its infancy. So instead of just continuing to be annoyed by hearing about it, why not like learn where it came from, like both psychology and that saying, and maybe take it as an opportunity to learn about some things myself. And I went, you know what, Tim, this fits perfect for History Month. Let's talk about where it even came from, right?
Exactly. I mean, that's the purpose of why we're doing this here, people. I mean, we don't get together to just talk about everyday life. We want to be able to entertain you and hopefully educate you in some ways based on the stuff we have found ourselves.
Exactly. So basically, Tim, have you ever heard like because right we've covered like we have some age difference, so we have kind of similar experiences in some ways, but in some ways different. But have you ever heard the whole idea that psychology is either not a real science, or that you've heard like, well, psychology, it's in its infancy and therefore like, almost like a throwaway line, right? So have you ever heard that? And if so, like what's your reaction to that?
Not specifically those lines, but definitely very similar stuff, especially with like heavily religious people. Like, yeah, Scientologists are not a big fan of psychology, unfortunately, but I don't think they're a big fan of logic either. The common theme that I see from people that do have, sentiments like that is kind of along the same lines of people that, want to dispute like proven science when it comes to stuff like dinosaurs or whatnot, or like regular, or the people that want to throw out, well, it says it in the name, scientific theory, it must be made up, without understanding what the scientific method is and how, scientists are able to come up with their conclusions and change them if further evidence comes down the line to prove that they are wrong. And because some people just have this mentality of something is either always going to be right, or if they admit one thing wrong, then it is all wrong, and that is not the case.
Right. And that's kind of like some of that identity threat we've talked about, right? Like that even makes sense because we do kind of want things to be in this neat little box. And like it always is and it always isn't, right? Like even look at some of the memes that share red flags of narcissists. Like we always want that to mean that you can identify a bad person and somehow keep them out of your life. However, if you sit there and maybe change the color of your glasses and look at those little individual things being listed and almost in a compassionate way, like think of those individual lines, and you might even be like, well, that's not really a narcissistic person. That sounds like somebody who's potentially struggling with something, right? So that is, I might think of the examples of some of the misuse of psychology in our culture. And I think that's where it's kind of neat to get to talk about this because we can't really talk about how we use psychology today, I think, without at least giving a visit to where it came from. So this is going to be a little bit more historically heavy, the Reverend Tracy kind of nerding out. So follow along, guys. Hopefully, I don't lose you in it because this is, like I
And
said, something that I even get to nerd about. Carl Jung, who's like one of my favorite like people in psychology ever. But the way we talk about mental health, the diagnoses, I should say, the therapy culture and the stigma, like none of it appeared out of nowhere. And as far as history goes, it really kind of goes back to, the birthplace of it being more from philosophy backgrounds. So if you think about people, like for the most of human history, questions about the mind belong to like Plato, Aristotle. You know what I mean? Like going back to before times of psychology, and they were all brilliant thinkers, but no experiments happened. And that's what's kind of neat is that is what kind of birthed some of psychology shift was when they started applying experimenting to it. So experimenting on human behavior rather than trying to think of the whys on human behavior, but never really testing it.
yeah, which is weird because it's like people do want to throw out the term, psychology's in its infancy, but as you're going to point out, not many infants are over, are close to 200 years old, you know.
Right.
um yeah, it's just weird though that that it did take a while for that shift from the philosophical thinking to the scientific thinking. It's like that little added extra bit of spice was missing, and in terms of testing it out instead of just sitting there thinking these grand thoughts, which the philosophers you mentioned are some of history's noted great minds. They just didn't take that extra step of testing out the theories.
Right. And it's really not unlike the history of like medicine. Once upon a time, doctors prescribed heroin as a cough suppressant. They used to perform lobotomies for depression, leeches for like certain blood things, right? Like we learn things and then we pivot. And psychology is no different, but it's been around like the formal scientific level for over like 145 years, right? Like the APA was founded in 1892. Once lab, which is where a lot of these tests started, was in 1879. So, and the first PhD was 1884. So this is not something that's like only been around for a minute, right? We have certain like genetic and scientific and medical practices that have been around less time than psychology, right? So I think like on a timeline basis itself, and that's only if you count it from that split from philosophy. But if you're somebody like me that kind of feels like philosophy and ancient texts were more the visual way of looking at things, and interpreting that they could see cause and effect, if you kind of align it that way, I personally argue it's kind of one of the oldest sciences around. The idea of observing behaviors being a way of pattern recognition, right? Just because they weren't tested doesn't mean that patterns weren't being recognized in human behavior.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, obviously, I don't want to imply that like Aristotle was like in his room like 24/7,
No, no,
not
no, no, no.
interacting with society. This is stuff that he was actually seeing. It's just people in his position at that particular time weren't going the extra step of using the scientific method when it comes to matters of the mind.
Right. It was basically once Wundt or how Wilhelm Wundt. I don't know if I'm saying his name correctly. It could be Wundt, but basically he just went like, what if we actually measured this? What if the mind could be studied scientifically, not just debated, right? But I go back to debating in a way is still talking about what you've observed, and that was a lot of early science and early medicine. Was hey, you touch that, and then you eat this thing, and sometimes you can die was effectively how some of the early like we decided, hey, we need to figure out a way to deal with our poop. You know what I mean? Like that was an issue for a while, but it was all observed before we had microscopes. But what Wundt did is he opened the first dedicated psychology lab and found ways of using like actual instruments to try to measure responses and reactions in a way. Right. So that's really what made it different, I think, where people designate that we're no longer in philosophy and we are into a science. So I guess that's what they're saying over like about 145 years ago. That's when that technically started, was in this laboratory, inspired by the greats.
And that again is not usually the age of an infant. I mean, there are things that I think you've touched upon it. There are things that we take as as gospel that we don't treat as dismissively as psychology. That are far younger.
Exactly. So something kind of fun that I learned about Wundt, by the way, like in all of this, he wrote an estimated like 53,000 pages in his career. And back then, that meant a lot. But this dude like apparently took no time off, and he trained students on the side. So he was extremely passionate about getting this recognized on the level, like scientifically. That's how strongly he felt. He legit dedicated his life to it. And like the pages alone seem to be like one of the testaments to like how strongly he felt. And that's where it's funny is like when most people think of psychology, they don't think about people like that, right? Like we always think of Freud, but even there was one between Wundt and Freud, William James, and he is really the father of American psychology. So he's the one that brought it here. But they had fundamentally different ideas about like the point of it all, because Wundt wanted to break down consensus into its component parts like chemistry, and James thought that was completely missing the point, and he wanted to understand the consensus like what it does, not just what it's made of, right? So the guy really almost wanting to think about it, yes, scientifically, like both wanted to be scientifically minded, but one seemed to be almost wanting to make it almost too sterile, I guess is what James was kind of saying. Does that make sense? Like he really almost wanted to be at a chemistry level of testing and understanding. And that's where James wanted to defer from it.
Yeah, and I mean, if you think about it too, like if you visit a counselor, for instance, and have a session, at the end of your session, the counselor in question is not going to go on straight away to the next client. They're going to be writing reports because that's what someone in their position will do. And it sounds like that, this was definitely the start of that. And you would think that the more ideas that are out there that are put onto paper, the more it is easy to, like if it comes to like an individual patient, identify stuff over time. Or if you're talking about psychology in the broader sense, if this stuff is being written out, this is going to be something that, like further down the line, you could say, oh, wait, this idea that we had back in the day doesn't work based on the evidence that we have now. So it needs to change.
Right. writing something down meant a lot back then because it allowed for further study. It allowed for questioning. You weren't just like basing it on the memory of something somebody told you once or twice, right? Like it almost makes it a little bit more irrefutable, like what they said, which then allows what they said to actually be properly challenged. And that seems to be what James did when he decided to bring it to Principles of Psychology in 1890. And that is like one of the most influential psychology books ever written. Like some kind of say it's almost like the Bible to the DSM, if that makes sense, like which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And that's the thing that actually gets updated that, you know, your psychologists and psychiatrists would be using to diagnose things, right? So this is more teaching about the principles behind it that turned it into those kind of things. But he introduced the ideas of like stream of consciousness, the idea that thoughts aren't separate units you can examine in isolation, that it's like a continuous flow, right? So that's almost like some of the predecessors to some of talk therapy, right? Of just letting people talk and have that flow, that you can't pin a thought down without changing it, was another one, right? Like if you actually try to think about the thing you were thinking about, you're going to start changing what the initial thought was. And like some of that, and how that interestingly helps us understand, even to some neurological levels, how memory works, right? And why it is kind of flawed. It's flawed with the best of intentions. It's almost like our brain was meant to challenge itself in a way, like that we should think about the thoughts, right? So, anywho, he is really cool, but the tension between Zwant and James, like, kind of actually started a tension that runs through psychology even to today, just because they wanted to approach it a little differently, which is a theme because we will see another famous breakup in psychology history as we talk, as we go through the timeline.
Yeah, the psychology version of Ben Affleck and Jennifer Lopez, but go ahead.
So that actually goes right into Freud, because he is unfortunately impossible to skip, but also it's hard to take him at the value to which he's been portrayed to psychology, because I think a lot of people think Freud is like that dominant actual father figure of psychology. And I think we've already kind of talked about he really wasn't. Like he's not the one that actually started it, right? But he did have some really revolutionary insights. Like things happen below the conscious awareness that are driving the behavior, right? So that we can kind of see where that value has come, right? That what is it? Hurt people, not using it as an excuse, but as an explanation, right? That other things are maybe driving behavior than just you want to be shitty, you want to cut the person off in traffic. Like maybe it's actually a control issue that's like from something in your childhood, right? Like I think that's what Freud gets most recognized for, is especially the childhood tie, and of course some of the sexual ties, right?
Because sometimes a cigar is just a cigar.
Right? Like psychosexual stages, Oedipus complex, penis envy, those are all based on some case studies in Vienna, right? And something that when I was studying psychology in college, because that's where kind of my nerd story came from, was that I was a psychology major and I worked in a psychology clinic. So obviously I had some interest in this, right? Was kind of when we started taking psychological statistics and learning about like biases in studies. And you learn that Freud really seemed more about proving something he believed than he was about truly maybe scientifically testing it as best as he could, right? Like when you cherry pick like a lot of say sex workers that had history of like assault and dysfunction in their homes, you might get a certain result that leans a certain way and can maybe make it look like a lot of people have those same things going on, right?
Yeah, because it's, you know, he in those particular instances that you mentioned, he wasn't using the true scientific method. He was trying to confirm his own beliefs and not prove how, you know, something like as simple as how could this be wrong. It's like you do need to challenge your own beliefs, especially in a field that has to do with the mind, or, in a medical sense, the body or something like that, because you can go on your own beliefs all you want, just like the people back in the day physically believed that, using leeches was somehow a good thing. And then time proved later on that, yeah, we don't need to use leeches anymore. We can use these other things.
Yeah, we can test things. We can use machines for cleaning blood because I think that was one of the early leaching things. But yeah, but his lasting contribution wasn't about his specific theories really. Even though it's funny because I think that's what he's most known for, like Freudian slips, and he's right. Oedipus complex is another one, but really, it's the framework, the whole idea of defense mechanisms, how that relates to the therapeutic relationship, and the whole early experience shaping adult psychology. That is the gold that did come from him. As much as I'm not a fan of how he did certain things, that's the stuff that was the good takeaways from Freud. And those seeds grew into modern attachment theory and trauma research. So even though it was kind of shaky ground, we did get a lot of good stuff from Freud. So any of my personal friends, if you've ever heard me bust on Freud, understand I have turneth my ways aroundeth, and I understand he had done technically more good than bad in the scientific community. I used to have some very negative feelings about Freud being kind of the front man of psychology.
Well, I can understand that. I mean, to use a less medical comparison here, it's like the people that kind of hold Stan Lee in comics up on this pedestal, compared to the people that don't. Like Stan did a lot of good in comics, he just did, but he also did his fair share of equally stupid things. And I think the whole point is, especially when someone is unfortunately no longer with us, is to have an honest assessment of their whole life and not just the parts that you either want to love or hate.
Right. Exactly. But now we could totally go. Oh, and also a little side fun fact is parallel to this in Russia. This is when Pavlov was figuring out the whole Pavlov's dog thing.
Woof
That was
woof.
kind of fun. Yeah, I didn't realize they were kind of happening, kind of parallel in time, it seems. But the whole idea, obviously, that stimulus response has a great effect. So that was also a fun one. But now, if you don't have any questions or thoughts on Freud, I can go into my favorite person in psychology that I don't think gets talked about enough, but has shaped a lot of what, especially we're seeing, I think, on social media.
Let's do it.
All right. So I wanted to start because I always thought it was cool that what I learned about this. There was a quote that kind of came up of something I guess was famously said from Carl Jung to Freud. And it's a Nietzsche quote of one repays a teacher badly if one remains only a pupil. And if only Freud had the humility to handle Jung actually being not his pupil anymore, because that seemed to be one of the bigger famous breakups in psychology, bigger than the one mentioned earlier between Wundt and James. So,
Didn't Darth Vader say at one point, "Once I was a student, now I am the master"?
well, but what's funny is I don't think Jung would have had that narcissistic level about it, if that makes sense. I don't know. I personally liked Jung. I'm not going to pretend like I fanboyed over him and super learned about his life, but I did think it was really funny, learning kind of how it played out between him and Freud. But when Jung and Freud first met in Vienna, this is back in 1907, they talked for 13 hours straight. And Freud was so just kind of taken by him that he had already nicknamed him his quote crown prince at the time. So you can already kind of see that there was maybe a level of narcissism going on between Freud, down to Jung, right? You're the crown prince. I'm not saying you're my equal. I'm just saying, you have some good ideas. But the person who would carry psychoanalysis into the future was kind of his point, that he was going to be the next after him. And I think that's kind of what presented the challenges that wound up for ending their relationship very, very publicly. But the friendship lasted about 6 years before it collapsed completely. And what it basically came down to, it was a very, very vicious breakup apparently, but it was all about, the core split was about what libido meant.
Because of course.
Like what is libido? But yeah, so the friendship lasted 6 years, and what it was Freud had actually written to Jung proposing they relate to each other as father and son for like a long time. So they had like a really intense, I almost wonder, like NRE level relationship. You know what I mean? Like he seemed to really almost be kind of in love with him. Now, I'm not saying there is any like actual sexual tension. I know Freud, with all the psychosexual stuff and believing everything was sexually driven, potentially there was, but I didn't dig into that from that angle. That one didn't really interest me too much. But it did kind of come down to libido and sex and the Oedipus complex, like that Freud like really needed Jung to believe like equally to him on this. And for Freud, libido meant sexual energy, and that it was the primary driver for essentially all human behavior. Like from art, culture, ambition, religion, like that it all basically came from sexual drives. And like that was the bedrock of his theory. And so if you didn't believe that, right, that kind of shook Freud to a sense, right? It was super important for his protege, right, to carry on that belief. But that turned into the one thing like Jung just couldn't accept about the situation. His clinical work with it, because he worked with like some psychotic patients whose fantasies weren't like personally sexual. Like they were filled with like mythical and religious imagery that showed up across cultures. So his whole thing was like he argued that libido was a broader life force, right? So it's kind of interesting to hear libido at all being referenced as not being sexual, right? Because we have to understand that at one point people argued what that word would mean. And this is that argument. Now, I hate to say that Freud won in a stupid way because obviously we think of sexual libido, right?
Yeah, but it sounds like it's also one of those terms like love, for instance, that can have many different meanings depending on the context that you're using it in.
Right. And like what's really sad is Jung wasn't trying to say that sexuality had nothing to do with it. He was just trying to say, hey, dad, maybe it's not the only thing. And that's what caused the literal, because I go back to Freud himself wanted to refer king, prince, father, son. That was his affection towards him, his level of affection. So basically, they had a parent child breakup over Jung actually wanting to expand on the idea, which is super ironic when you think about it. But that's beside the point. But that's really what caused the big breakup, and that's what led Jung to do Psychology of the Unconscious in 1912. And that book broke everything. He reinterpreted libido as general mental energy, like we talked about, and introduced the seeds of the collective unconscious, and that kind of really, and even some of the mythological parallels that happen sometimes in some of the early psychology talking, because right, we talked about how him dealing with the psychotic patients, like those levels, he came across a lot of those themes. So of course it came more into his writing. But yeah, super interesting, big split there. And yeah, like I don't think Freud ever really recovered from that one. Like that big breakup. Like he, I want to say there were letters found where he was still begging Jung, like years later, to please not abandon the sexual theories that we worked so hard on to prove clinically together, or something like that. Like even kind of funny to watch, like how that so parallels to a lot of people's like experience with their parents of whatever it is they had the breakup over. Like part of it is that the parent can't just let it go and has to keep instilling like you must believe this thing, right? So it is kind of interesting to watch that play out between like two of kind of the biggest names that shaped psychology as it is today. But anywho, so after that big famous split with Freud, Jung went through what he called a quote creative crisis, which is basically a period of intentional deep dive into his own unconscious. And this is where we get into what Jung has actually given us today. And this is where I think even you, I don't know how closely you follow some of the mental health hashtags. I know they come up because we're considered a bit of a mental health podcast. This is where you're going to start hearing maybe some familiar terms like attachment theory. I feel like gets a little bit more driven in at the parent level, right? You talk more about that early attachment because it's been used a lot to like tell you not to be a shit parent, right? But I think this is where like a lot of people will kind of recognize Jung's influence, even though we didn't have a name of who to say thank you to, his influence on kind of modern psychology. This time he kept a lot of detailed notes on visions and dreams, right? So this is getting into the important of what our dreams and what our unconscious is telling us. And out of that whole, again, his creative crisis that he called it himself, he came to concepts known for the collective unconscious, archetypes, the shadow, individuation, introversion, and extroversion. So, in all of his just, I need to look inward and answer some things because obviously he took that breakup pretty hard too, right? He called it a creative crisis for a reason. He wouldn't have used that word for nothing. But yeah, he kind of helped come up with a distinction between introvert and extrovert. That's Jung, baby. That idea that humans fall into personality types based on whether they're oriented outward or inward. And he also identified 4 psychological functions: the thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. And if that doesn't sound familiar, maybe you've never taken the Myers-Briggs type indicator. But that gets used like sometimes in careers. And I think sometimes in school now, they're starting to introduce the Myers-Briggs testings, right? I feel like,
I
yeah,
think if I'm not mistaken, I believe I may have taken it at some point in school. So it definitely sounds familiar. I'm familiar with that name.
Yeah, which is really only kind of ironic because Jung probably would have had mixed feelings or at least some hesitation on a personality quiz that would essentially label you. But that's beside the point. That's just something that he's definitely influenced that I feel like a lot of people would be somewhat familiar with. Like I said, there's also archetypes, the whole reoccurring symbolic figures, like the hero, the shadow, the trickster, the mother. And that shows up in everything from Marvel movies to therapy offices to marketing strategies. So it's kind of interesting how much I even learned that he kind of trickled through everything in these concepts. Like to even influence how we are marketed at goes back to a lot of the stuff that Jung figured out during this post breakup with daddy time.
And dreams as well. I know there in my 20s there was a time to where I was interested in diving deeper into my dreams. What they would say to kind of record your dreams is like as soon as you get up, write down immediately what you remember your dreams to be, and then you can study them from there. But it seemed like it was also kind of co-opted by like the spiritual movement as well, because they do have like dream dictionaries to where you can see something like, well, I dreamed of a boat. Well, a boat, if you dreamed of a boat, this means X, Y, and Z. So I ended up not sticking with that for too long, but interesting that
Right.
interesting its birth.
Right, like actually came from somebody trying to understand what his life maybe meant at a certain critical fight of, again, a father figure. We all know how important that can be. And obviously he felt it agreeable, right? He went through this like right after. And it is kind of interesting, like some of the dream theory, right? Like, oh, if your teeth are falling out. And now I know that seems to be like a common one, your teeth falling out. And I guess that can just be associated, like you're just going through some stress. You're probably like worried because it's an out of control thing, like a tooth falling out or whatever. It's probably one of the more mysterious things because we can't even really watch our teeth. So them just falling out randomly, lack of control. But I mean, you can take that as it may. Sometimes you just have really weird dreams. I very rarely remember my dreams. And when I do, they're always fucking weird and usually the result of having to take like some cough and cold medicine. Like I had a dream that my friend who is already currently and very happily married was getting married, and my GPS, I was trying to like manage something on my screen and somehow drove up into the church and was in the aisle with my car, and I was like, "Hey April, what's up?" And then I woke up. I'm not sure that had a deeper meaning. Sometimes I think a dream is just a dream, but it is interesting exactly that like that stuff dates back to Jung, and him talking about studying, the idea of studying what is unconscious in you, and how that can be very important for understanding why you do a lot of what you do. And then it goes back to what's funny and sad is it doesn't negate any of Freud's theory that early sexual experience would, of course, shape that, right?
But it just expanded upon it. And, Father Freud was not willing to learn from that.
From the sun, exactly. So, yeah, and then I think another one, like other than obviously the idea of what goes on in your dreams could have a deeper meaning, I would have to say one of the most culturally pervasive ideas that he's actually gotten into now mainstream is the idea of shadow work and what that actually means. So, the shadow to him in his theory is the part of yourself that you've pushed into the unconscious. It's the traits, the impulses, and desires that don't fit with the image that you want to project. And it's not always bad stuff. So I guess that's the one side of it that I feel gets missed because these can also be good traits. Like you can think you're a bad person and that you think bad things deserve to happen to you, but meanwhile it's like you're the person that has the dollar and gives it to like the person who's struggling. But you know what I mean? So you can also push down good traits about yourself if you believe bad things, just like you can push down bad things you do if you really want to believe that you're a good person. That was a lot of what he helped uncover with this whole idea of the shadow self.
And shadow work, of course, is something that has been talked about many, many times in our archives, thanks to you.
Yeah, because even I may have probably mentioned Jung a few times because I know when I learned about it back in college, I thought it was a super neat concept, right? Like actually looking at yourself to understand yourself better, which is kind of funny because this goes into why I actually do regard the Bible and other religious texts with some regard, is because when you really look at a lot of what it's saying is it is telling you to look inward and know yourself. And so really I think it's funny that shadow work and shadow theory as established by Jung has long been trying to say this too, that you should try to understand yourself because the shadow doesn't disappear when you repress it. It actually is just going to continue driving behavior from underground. And oh my gosh, you've heard that before, right, Tim? I feel like anybody who's been in therapy has heard that before. But yeah, so basically the idea that things that you repress are going to show up as things that trigger you, like disproportionately. The patterns that you keep repeating, the qualities that you judge most harshly in other people, which are often ones that you deny in yourself. So the whole idea of projection, right? So this is where it's like, yeah, it seems very abundantly clear. I would say mainstream mental health conversation is overwhelmingly like Jungian theory peppered throughout it, way more than some of the Freudian talking therapy, right? Like, yeah, there is some of the background, but instead of only sexual relation, we're getting into all of the ways your raising can influence you. But yeah, so basically, Jung called it projection. We call it projection now. There's just a lot, right? And seeing your own shadow in someone else like should be that kind of sign to you to kind of investigate internally. And I know that's a concept we've brought up many times on the show, especially when we were doing our New Year's resolutions and kind of renewal month, right? Brought that up a lot, I feel like.
Well, think about too when it comes to projection. I mean, we've talked about it before when it comes to like politicians talking about stuff. I mean, how many politicians have been virulently against the LGBTQ community, and then you find out, they have a secret gay lover themselves.
Right.
It's which is not to say that people that have anti-LGBTQ thoughts are necessarily homosexuals themselves, but it still the amount of people that have those views that you find out are celebrating those views themselves in private, kind of like the people too, like the people that want to, say like drag performers are like groomers or something like that. And then you find out that they're the ones that are doing inappropriate things with kids. It's like, come on, think about this stuff before you open your mouth about it.
Well, and I think something that's really interesting to point out, Tim, is like there are other drivers for pointing something out, even if, like your point, not everybody who is super loudly against LGBTQ is secretly homosexual or queer, right? However, I would say what they are jealous of is that they want the ability to explore themselves on that level and to feel confident that they've made those choices, right? Because a lot of it, I think, becomes that whole validation that you're not actually trying to say that's wrong because you really need that to be wrong. It's that you need more people agreeing with you because it validates your decisions. So there is that level of jealousy to it. Like it doesn't have to be a one for one thing, right? That you're noticing and reacting to the thing that's triggering you because it's about what's triggering you, right? Like sometimes it's not actually that somebody said a sentence to you. Sometimes it can just be the person that has triggered you. Sometimes it is the song that was playing in the background that you barely heard but was triggered you, right? Like sometimes it's not as directly about the thing in front of you. And I think that's what a lot of the shadow integration theory brought up was that you need to investigate yourself. And so when you have a wild reaction to something, that is more of a calling for the shadow work. And it's funny because that's why it's become so popular in like emotional intelligence and self-help culture is the idea of addressing the shadow because it does kind of correlate a lot with having high emotional intelligence, understanding it, not ignoring the fact that it's there, and addressing it. It's kind of like even in some of the parent stuff nowadays, there's no longer this expectation to be a perfect human as a parent. But what you should do is slow down, apologize, maybe as age appropriate, talk about the things you were going through that led up to you boiling over, not in a blaming them way. You can say you were tired and overstimulated and your child deciding that's the time to have a little kazoo party. That's not blaming your kid. That's just saying, hey, I was in a point where I was not in a cool space for you to come in with your kazoo party. You know what I mean? Like doing that is actually teaching emotional regulation and responsibility. So there's value in doing this practice, and it's long been talked about. One of the famous Jung quotes I wanted to make sure I got in here somewhere was until you make the unconscious conscience, it will direct your life and you will call it fate.
Yeah,
So
putting a name to a face, putting a name to a face.
yes,
That,
that was a Jung idea, concept, quote that until you investigate why am I reacting poorly to this, you're going to say, this is how I am. So that was a lot of that. And that's going to probably get referenced back to later when we loop back to where psychology is today.
all right. Preview, folks. Stay tuned.
Yeah, because we're going to take a little break in kind of the timeline conversation and talk about this whole idea of so why do people say it's still in its infancy? Like, what is this argument? Because I know I'm not the only one that's heard it, right? But typically it's like, so why does it show up? And it's because it's doing a job. This statement, when somebody says psychology is still in its infancy, they're usually not making a measured scientific like evaluation of it. They're using a phrase that sounds like critical thinking to shut down a conversation, usually at the point that it becomes uncomfortable, right? And I think this goes into the thing that that I've brought up a lot because I feel like I've run into it more the last 4 to 5 years in our culture is this whole identity threat, right? Like you don't want to absorb knowledge when you feel like your identity is being threatened. And what threatens your identity probably more than any other science out there than psychology.
Yes, I mean we see that in in the United States at least in with politics. Everything is political now, and this whole notion that the side that you believe in has flaws really irks a lot of people. Like you can be a progressive person, but if you come out and criticize the Biden administration for trying to go ahead with a second term when he was at an age to where he just couldn't physically and mentally pull it off anymore, all of a sudden you're a bad guy, you support Trump, you're a Nazi, blah blah.
Right. The infancy claim is elegant because it lets you acknowledge that psychology exists, but it lets you kind of quarantine any findings as they seem fit to you, which is just the level of cherry picking that we don't tend to like on our show, right? Like it goes up to the being a pet peeve of mine on a religious level when we cherry pick the Bible. It is just as damaging. It is just as damaging when we cherry pick studies to try to say like this causes a thing or this doesn't cause a thing, and then you find out that it was just a very introductory level, low level experiment ran on mice in a lab setting, right, which does not always translate one to one for a human. So yeah, like if it goes back to, yeah, I guess you could take the person into consideration, right? If the person is saying it's in its infancy, like do they also consider neuroscience in its infancy? Because I got some news for you. If you appreciate brain scans and any of the surgeries for that stuff, it's a lot younger than psychology. So it goes back into, right, there's signs if somebody's cherry picking this or if they actually don't believe it is a vetted enough science.
Well, think about hardware. I mean, computers are far younger than psychology. I mean, granted they did have, computers going back like the 30s at least. For ones that were powered by like what would be powering a calculator today, but people definitely still believe in that. They don't think computers are in their infancy, so we shouldn't have any sort of interaction with them. It is proven that they work, and with time we've made them better, and people just go ahead and accept that as proven theory. It's something that is if we're going from 1879 till now, that's about 145 years. That is not something in its infancy. I mean, there are a lot of things that we take as proven fact that are far, far, far younger. To your point, people that do want to say that it's in its infancy are just using it to, as you said, shut down a conversation, and that needs to be explored.
Exactly, because unfortunately, the real issue that's had here is that when this is applied, it actually can give you feelings, right? Like saying that technology getting better over years and years isn't going to necessarily threaten somebody's identity near as much as saying like, hey, these studies touch on things like that explain why you are the way you are, who you even are, right? And that goes right back to when you feel like your identity is being threatened, you don't view facts as facts, you view them as an attack, and so you do respond likewise. And that's why it's like a lot of times when this is thrown out there, it should be fair to say that it is in things that people don't want to challenge. For example, look at spanking and corporal punishment. There are parents who still do it. There are parents who apply it selectively, and there are parents who do not do it at all. And if you're challenging whether or not, if somebody believes they are a good parent and are either doing it, applying it, or applying it extremely selectively, giving them facts on it, like depending on the study and like what they were actually doing and the cases and blah blah blah, like that is going to threaten their identity of being a good parent. And some might understand why that would be taken so personally and why you might not want to immediately believe that you're a bad parent.
Are you
Like
saying I'm beating my kids? You know?
you're saying I'm abusive, and it's like, no, like I get that there's a difference between like taking the belt and like chasing them around the house with it and like, hey, if you do this, it is dangerous, and I'm going to try to do my best to understand in these years where you can't communicate as effectively, like this is bad, right? That there are in fact like differences to that, and there are studies that talk about the differences to that. But when you do the blank statements, it's going to make people not even get curious enough to investigate what they're doing because they're taking it more as a threat than they are as receiving information. So basically, psychology actually explains in and of itself why people have this reaction to it. Funny.
Yeah, and a lot of times, going back to the question that you opened up the show with, a lot of times when I've seen people kind of disregard psychology and whatnot, those people do tend to be more religious, and there are a bunch of psychological findings out. Like when it comes in, and I believe we're going to be touching on it a little later, but like psychological studies on like the homosexual community, for instance, that if you bring that stuff up, they're going to be like, I don't believe it. I just don't care because the Bible says this. The Bible says this. And yeah, it's those people.
Right, right. And there's a lot of like I've already kind of touched on is there are concepts in the Bible that I feel psychology and sciences actually back up and don't challenge. There's been like some verses around earthly or worldly knowledge that have been cherry picked and misused that made people maybe kind of believe that it was science and knowledge that was the bad guy. And it's not. I don't think it ever was intended to be, because by the whole point of a lot of what you see between the Old Testament and New Testament was this idea that new information and culture should actually shape how we practice. Like, because that was like the whole point. And I get it. If you weren't one of the people that had to like read chapters of the Bible for your college education, I understand. That was my burden to bear, not yours. But that was like probably the biggest difference between OT and NT of when Jesus came on, right? Was like this idea, and that's like if you look at any other books and prophets, what you believe or don't believe, like that's essentially what is happening. Is that it does imply that we should change as we gain knowledge and gain cultural changes, right? That you do have to evolve. Anything does. Psychology, science, like case in point, we don't use leeches anymore, right? We don't do lobotomies anymore for this shit. Like we do learn, and there's a lot of other things that evolve as we learn. And that's why I think it's funny as anybody that kind of tries to undercut it of in that sense of like that it's supposed to be like factual and is and always was, but we don't apply that evenly to other sciences. Learning new shit all the time. But yeah, like it's been around for a while. And I just don't think there's too much that actually supports that just because we learn something new about it, it will forever remain in infancy status. Because if that's the case, obstetric practice is still in its infancy then, right? Because my gosh, how we do things different now in the birthing process than 100 years ago, let alone 150 years ago, right? So if that's going to be your basis for it, everything is always in its infancy, and just, I guess, I don't know, don't take in any new information.
Yeah, that like wasn't it only like 100 or so years ago that doctors just started washing their hands before surgery?
Right, and I want to say that was like in it was a giving birth. It was like in that process. It was delivering babies that they put together how important it was to wash your hands and wear surgical masks, because it was about not introducing things to a very precarious environment, that your patient is actually the one that is in more danger than you contracting something from them. They are actually literally laid open, and anything you blow in their direction is not meant to go in there, right? Because opening. But anyway, so yeah, saying it's in its infancy, it's just a little bit. I just can't understand that anymore, right? Because in what case, I guess like maybe if you're, what is it, the Amish that still live, like they don't do electricity. Am I
I
thinking of
believe
that
so. Yeah,
correctly?
yeah,
Yeah, like maybe there I can understand, like not because, right, they subscribe to maybe none of it, and I'm totally speaking out of ignorance. I will note that here. I do not know any Amish people, unfortunately. Been hanging out with a couple of Mormons more lately, so I feel like I understand more about them than I ever have in my past. But I don't know any Amish people, so if I've misspoken, I apologize.
yeah. We
But
apologize to our Amish audience out there.
right, big podcast crews, those Amish. But so yeah, I think I feel like we can reasonably debunk, is it or is it not in its infancy? I think it's not in its infancy. Like when we compare it to how many things we have embraced that are a lot newer. Like we trust our phone more than psychology, maybe question that motivation a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it is not in its infancy. Does that mean things can't be challenged? No, because I think that's the whole purpose of what the modern psychology has been. That's that constant challenging, thanks to using scientific method on the mind and everything. So things can and should be challenged and debated so that we can get to the bottom of stuff. But it's is it in its infancy? No. I mean, people that are saying that are just being completely dismissive and ignorant of history and all the positives that have come from psychology.
Right. And I also think part of it is with psychology, it kind of makes things a little bit complicated, right? Because this has been established that this process began 145 years ago, but really, I would dare say both of us probably in our younger years remember that you didn't talk about it if you had depression. You didn't talk about it if you had anxiety. Like you just didn't talk about it. Like that there was kind of a shame. So something has definitely happened in this long road of it becoming as acceptable as it is today. Because I dare say that it has, to a point, almost become cool to have a thing of some sort. I don't want to say an ism because I feel like that has become a new way that we've said autism now, and that's not what I mean. Because it used to be having an ism was any of them, but to have a depressive disorder, to have an anxiety disorder, has almost become something that we started to tie to identity, and some might argue an overcorrective way. So it's been a long road, though, right? Because before the late 19th century, like mental illness was basically understood through two lenses. It was either demonic possession or moral weakness. So treatment meant that you were either preyed upon, like you were prayed over, you were punished, or you were confined, right? Because you're making these choices and you're making them so much that we're just going to confine you and put you away. And so obviously this idea that this is how you treat people who maybe act in ways you don't want them to do has a lot of people who still support treating it that way, right? Because it's so simple to say you do bad thing, you get locked up forever or you get killed, right? Depending on what the bad thing is, if it's bad enough and what state you're in. So this complicates other systems. So I could even see where some of that discrediting statement we talked about before, who makes money off of it other than our private prison system?
Or our religious businesses out there, which again, to be clear, obviously, we're not saying every single religious institution out there is bad, but there are some that do benefit financially from trying to get people to not think about this stuff.
Right, and that even goes to the early psychiatric hospitals, also known as asylums, were basically warehouses. It wasn't really about treating them. Like, yeah, some treatments happened there, but it's kind of hard to tell if those were actually treatments or if they were just kind of applying what they thought. Like, you throw enough shit on the wall, maybe something will stick, right? Like, some of early shock therapy was justified in these places. And a lot of it was because, I don't know, maybe they got really docile after having their brains zapped. And I could see the mistake in thinking that that was better. I'm not saying it was good. I'm just saying that from an observant and not testing anything else about it, that if you did something to a patient and it made them easier to deal with in a warehouse setting, that justified a lot of those things being practiced the way they were. Right? So really shame behind it kind of and not talking about it and how to apply it appropriately kind of led to the pray away type camps, the conversion camps. Like if you want to talk about it, like, yeah, we can call that spade a spade. Homosexuality was considered in the DSM for a long time, but thanks to advocacy and not ignoring it that it was in there. Actually, the opposite of ignoring it, and therefore addressing it on a level that could say, hey, this now proves that this is not a thing anymore. And I do think that that's a worthy thing to appreciate, right? That if something is considered a mental disorder, and there are enough people that say, no, it is not. And now let's use the same respected way that you've tried to prove things to be in this book to say that it does not belong in this book. I think that strengthens the argument, right? Right, like fact tested should still remain fact.
Yes, I mean, because we don't want to fall into the Freud trap, I guess, of, having a preconceived belief and making your avenue of study kind of use it to support that belief instead of going with the mindset of, is this wrong? Because if that were the case, then it would still be listed in the DSM book as homosexuality being somehow a psychological disorder when it is not. To your point, enough people challenged it that the people in question, the psychologists in question, ran tests and then decided, yeah, you know what? We were wrong. It's not in.
Exactly. And that's the thing is like, and there's a lot of people who want to demonize the DSM because it ever had things like that in there. But the thing is if you understand where it came from, there's actually some cool respect for it because it didn't even exist until 1952. And it was largely born from World War II because the VA needed to document and treat what they were finally recognizing as psychological conditions of returning veterans. So, really, DSM in psychology has a big backing of supporting our veterans. So, if you give a shit about how shell shock finally got recognized as PTSD, particularly combat PTSD, and if you give a crap about the mental health of our veterans, you should kind of support the idea of the DSM because that's where it came from was to help get real help for them, stuff that did work, moving away from storing them in warehouses, aka asylums, right? It helped break up that demographic because that was soaringly bad for a while. Like how our veterans got treated. Like, I think most people can agree we have had a history of not doing great by them.
Yeah, and I think was it? I don't know if it was America or England during World War One. Soldiers that did have what they called shell shock at the time, if they did not get returned to the field, I believe it was England, to where those soldiers would be killed.
Yep. And
They
then,
yeah.
yeah, because that was, if you couldn't deal with them, unfortunately, that was how, when you don't have the means to deal with something, there was justified reasons for doing what they did. And I will stand by, I'm not saying they were right. I'm saying I understand with the limited knowledge and information that was had at the time why certain conclusions were drawn as being the right thing to do at the time. But yeah, so that's kind of the birthplace of the DSM. The DSM 1 only had 106 disorders and only 130 pages. The current DSM 5 TR, which the TRs they come out with in between the big numbers, has over 300 disorders. And it's not all like diagnostic inflation. Part of it is genuinely better recognition of real suffering that previously had no name, and that we found over time a way to collect these thoughts and share them, because again, this even goes back to Wundt, right? When things get written down, it matters.
Yeah, and like take autism for instance. Back in the day, autism had a very narrow spectrum of what it quote unquote was, and then over time that got broadened. Like in the '90s, I think is when it started getting expanded as to who fell under the autism spectrum, and then of course the anti-vax people took that as a flag of, hey, how can we make this even worse for everybody, and then started linking, like the vaccine shots to more kids getting autism when that is just not the case. All the expanded thing was stating was that this is a bigger issue. Some people have it more severe than others, but we, thanks to using the scientific method and all that stuff, we've determined that more people fall under this than we previously thought before.
Exactly. Like maybe it's not that increase of vaccines has increases the case of autism. Maybe it's that we are just developing scientifically and are therefore able to give more people the vaccines because of access, while at the same time able to diagnose autism and understand that there is a spectrum of it actually. Like that it's not just all the way over to the right or all the way over to the left. Like that most kids with autism have a scale, right? And this is like part of that scale has helped develop programs like the long-term caregivers that help them live independently so their life quality is not tied to when their parents pass away, because that was a reality for a lot more of the low functioning side of it. And I know I've been told, I guess that's not like the best thing to say, but that's just because sorry guys, I did psychology a long time ago. I'm trying to figure out what the right way to phrase that is. But basically like the further end of that scale, right? Where you definitely need that help to succeed. Like they've had more advocacy and therefore there are actually like, yeah, insurances and Medicaids and things like that have started to cover that kind of stuff. Medicare starts to cover that type of stuff now because it actually makes sense, but it's key correlation does not always mean causation. Those things happen to correlate, but that doesn't mean they caused each other. That's like the whole ice cream sales and murder, right? Like ice cream sales go up, so murder rises. Like one of the more playful examples of correlation does not always mean causation. Turns out it's about summertime. It's not really about ice cream sales, right? Like, so yeah, maybe the case numbers going up is not just because this other thing went up.
And I think it's good too that scientists have psychologists have taken this time to do that deeper study, because you brought up asylums. I mean, if we go back to the episode where we interviewed your friend Sheriff Ray Cyphers, he talked about how in the 60s was when asylums were on the whole kind of broken down and stopped at that particular point, because it was essentially being used as more of a warehouse type of situation. It wasn't being used to effectively treat the people in question. It was another form of jail for people that really needed help. And unfortunately, like we do often in America, we getting rid of it, we didn't have a proper solution in place to help fix it, because there are some people that do need long-term psychiatric help that maybe don't necessarily, even for a short period of time, need to be among regular society. I can get behind that, but we have not done our best to find and properly fund that type of solution to help people. But I think the benefit of these psychologists doing these tests have made it to where the government in other ways are helping people like my youngest who in a couple of days is going to be 20. He is autistic, and as of right now, he's not going to be able to live alone. Do I think that there could be a point in the future? I think so, because I'm the ultimate positive thinker when it comes to my kids and stuff like that. But there's also the possibility that he may need some form of help for the rest of his life. And it is good that we have now in place, thanks to this work from psychologists, things that can help him survive this thing called life without having to depend on me or his mother if we passed away.
Exactly. And it's nice that nowadays we live in more of a culture where that is possible than just a handful of years ago. Because it's like, for most of the 20th century, seeking mental help, like that meant admitting weakness, right? Because we go back to, we're still having this hangover of how we dealt with it. Like we're recognizing it's not demons, maybe, but it's still viewed largely as like a lack of self-control, effectively, right? For a long time, you're risking employment and being labeled in the time where those labels were still viewed as inherently bad, right? So that's where people suffered in silence. This is where a lot of surprising suicides seem to happen, right? Because you shove it down, because the culture made help seeking dangerous. When you can lose your job and lose friendships because it gets viewed in this way of a weakness, that's almost as bad to some people, right? So the push to normalize the mental health conversation and reduce the stigma, like, that needed to happen, right? There was a lot of harm happening. So as I talk about the potential overcorrection we're experiencing, I want to highlight that correction absolutely needed to happen. But unfortunately, when we correct as a culture, and I know this is a concept I've brought up before, the pendulum rarely stops dead center. And there's real evidence that the culture has kind of swung past normalization into territory where diagnoses are becoming identity, and where therapy speak gets weaponized in relationships and normal human suffering gets pathologized. Do you know what I mean? So it's important to address that we are kind of showing all of the indications that we're still in an overcorrect, because ideally we want the pendulum to come back to center, right? Like, even we started the show talking about politics. I don't really want the furthest swing left of what we're doing right now. I know a lot of people say that's what we need, but I'm tired of it. I would still love to have conversations so that maybe we can swing not as far, so that we can start landing in the middle, right? Because when you swing far one direction and you're still swinging farther the next, it's less likely you're going to come to center, right?
And
So we
it
could
makes
be, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, and it makes the swings even further, in either direction. So if we go to the left, maybe the swing back to the right would be even further than what we're experiencing now.
Right. And so I think this is why it's important to talk about the fact that we are showing signs that we're in an overcorrect, if we don't want it to overcorrect hard in the opposite direction of our mental health, right? Our mental health conversation. I don't want it to disappear again. I don't want it to get shoved down. But I also think it really warrants a discussion when we start tying our diagnoses or isms, whatever you want to call them, to our identity, because that's where you're going to start viewing therapy. The whole point of getting these things kind of labeled was so that we could actually address them therapeutically. But if you're starting to view that as an attack on your identity, that's going to create a whole other problem. So that's where I wanted to kind of, as we work towards finishing up this long conversation of working towards that, I think this is the important bit to pick up. If we're going to talk about the history of it, let's talk about how that history got us to today.
Because, Tammy, on social media, not all of your exes are narcissistic. They're
Exactly. I'm sorry. Like, first of all, let's do that one, because that's one of my least favorite overused terms, is calling somebody a narcissist. Such a narcissist. Well, newsflash, by the law of Jungian shadow work integration theory and a little term called projection, if you are seeing it and constantly pointing it out, you might have some narcissisms in yourself that you're not checking. And I think it's very important to phrase it that way, right? Because we all have narcissistic tendencies. I know we don't like to believe that. We all want to have this identity that there is not a narcissistic bone in our body. But the thing is we are kind of inherently selfish. We want to live, we want to eat, we want things, right? Like, and I think as long as you acknowledge that selfishness, it's really not that bad of a thing, right? Because it allows you to keep that in check. Like, okay, well, is this reasonably selfish, or is this just selfish, right? Because even in Buddhism, like, the Dalai Lama has like a saying about being selflessly selfish, and that even being selfless and doing good things is a selfish act because it makes you feel good to do good things. But that doesn't mean that you don't do the good things because you're trying to never be selfish, right? Like, there's a point where being selfish is actually good. But if we can't have a good relationship with that part of our shadow self, we're going to continue to be ruled by things and think it is fate.
Yeah,
Right back to the same point.
Yeah, I mean, because we are the stars of our own movie called life, but the sooner, I guess, you can recognize that you are also a supporting player in other people's lives, that can allow you the freedom, I guess, to acknowledge when you messed up. A lot of people don't want to, when it comes to like a relationship breakup, for instance. We've talked about that a lot on the show here. They don't want to put in the work to think, where did I go wrong in this particular relationship? And of course, we're not talking about, relationships that ended due to like domestic violence or anything like that. That's a pretty clear example, but just a regular standard breakup. It takes two to tango, and people don't want to put in that thought of, what did I do? What can I change about me to make sure this doesn't happen again? Because if you don't address that, it will happen again. And yeah, it's like, on the one hand, you are selfish in the sense that, being that you are the star of your own movie called life. You're going to be worried about your own needs at the end of the day, and
Hmm.
that's how we live. That's how we are able to succeed and grow old and all that stuff. But it is important to acknowledge that you are not the center of the universe. You are just a star in that universe.
Right. And that's where social media has actually really complicated the conversation in our overcorrection right now, because doing real shadow work doesn't sell half as well as making your audience feel justified in their decisions and that they can do no wrong. So, those algorithms that are planting mental health stuff at you, I will say be careful. Like, I've had to take some out of my feed because they were doing some weird toxic positivity bullshit, and the 10 signs that you're with a narcissist. And I was like, oh no, these are like, to me, signs of not stuff I want piped into my brain, right? Because they've actually started to do research on this now. Content on TikTok found that majority of the content about ADHD and autism contained claims that were scientifically not accurate, and some were actually classified as potentially damaging. The hashtag therapy talk has 1.7 billion views. Hashtag mental health on Instagram has 49 million posts. And like that is some reach. And that is a lot of unvetted mental health content hitting a feed that is designed to capture you and make you believe it in a snapshot. And I think this has very much contributed to our overcorrection, right? Because people that want to challenge you to be a better person sometimes are being displayed in a little listicle meme is, well, this is actually a sign that they're a narcissistic asshole. Not at all like they're maybe a good friend that is just trying to ask you questions.
I mean, you're not going to solve a complicated issue with a meme, you know,
Right,
and people fall into this trap a lot too. Like, I know, I don't know if she does this now, but I know in the past, my sister, anytime she had any sort of ailment, would go to WebMD. And I have the worst thing possible. And she's not the only one. A lot of people have done that over time, and I
right.
think that is the danger of this tool that we have called the internet. The fact that you have that ability to do your own research, but a lot of times people that are doing their own research are doing the research based on simple things like memes and whatnot, to where it is presented more as a black and white issue, when when it comes to psychology, it is not. You got to dive. There's no list of 10 that is going to solve like autism, for instance, or
Right.
narcissism. It's a much deeper dive than that. Now, having said that, if a meme is what causes you to dive deeper into actual vetted sources, and then you can come up to educated conclusions at that point. That's fine. I'm not dismissing
Yeah.
that at all, because it's like with Wikipedia, for instance. They say in colleges, don't use it as a source, but Wikipedia can be a good jumping off point. However, if you're only using Wikipedia as, I learned this from Wikipedia, you didn't really learn anything.
Exactly. And it's like, I would say, like, memes based on therapy speak, right? So, therapy speak has real value, like real value. The spread of psychological language into everyday conversation has done something genuinely useful because it gave people words for previously nameless experiences. And there's something that I've long said about this concept of naming it to tame it. But the key is you need to also be willing to tame it, right? So terms like gaslighting, trauma response, attachment style, emotional regulation, like these have helped millions of people understand themselves that were maybe raised in a time where those terms weren't known, right? Like our us millennials, like our parents did not really thrive on concepts like emotional regulation, right? That didn't really exist. But where therapy speak has value, it can also present real dangers, right? Because the problem is when the language gets detached from the actual clinical precision that it was made for. And case in point, gaslighting now seems to mean disagreeing with me. These are some of the memes I have seen that have hit my algorithm of interest in mental health, right? And these are the ones like, I'm going to unfollow you, right? Gaslighting, like coming like, oh, if you disagree with me, you're gaslighting me, which is not what that means. Trauma sometimes means being uncomfortable now. And narcissist is anybody that displays selfishness ever for even a moment in their life. Like when those terms lose that precision, they start to lose clinical usefulness and they can harm people who have those conditions. You know what I mean? Because look at like sociopathy and psychopathy. Like if you actually go and listen to interviews of people that have been diagnosed with that, they're almost always cut out because everyone assumes they're going to be some fucking serial killer. And
Yeah,
but that's a stigma that got perpetrated in normalizing therapy speak. So that's where again it has had its damage too, but it's definitely seemed to do more good.
because I did see. Speaking of memes, I did see a meme about psychopathy, and somebody. I guess they said that I guess you're considered a psychopath if you like hang out at home a lot and don't have that many friends. And I'm like, then that I guess that makes me a psychopath. Maybe
Exactly.
yeah,
It's so funny, like, those little things that it gets misused are, like, one of the more recent ones was and I actually had pinpointed how they did phrase it correctly because it said psychologist says, like, if you watch a lot of true crime, like, that whatever you're, like, intended to do something, I don't know, that you could, like, kill somebody or something, I forget, it was, like it was a dumb thing, and it was shared for a minute, but I noticed it even said psychologist, and when I looked into it, it was like, yeah, some psychologist voiced an opinion that maybe if you really enjoy watching true crime or recreation crime stories, like, that you might have, like, some sociopathic tendency or something like that. It was just a one-off. It was one psychologist saying something. And if that's not just a great example of where our social media can just fucking run with something and it kind of cause more damage and possibly stereotyping and in-grouping and out-grouping, that's a pretty decent example. I also think calling everyone a narcissist is kind of an example because I feel like that's been a big one. The your ex is a narcissist, you're with a narcissist, how to tell if you're friends with a narcissist. Like I almost have started like that's my trigger word now to just not following somebody anymore. Unless it's like identifying the narcissisms within myself. You know, that one I'll keep following. But I think anything going, here's signs that somebody can be labeled so clearly, that should be a red flag that that's not genuine mental health advice. That's therapy talk.
Now, also too, I think those people are very much guilty of kind of using those phrases to shut down conversations just as much as people that want to say psychology is in its infancy. If everybody that you're in a relationship with, that you are no longer in a relationship with, is a narcissist, that doesn't give you that gives you permission to not think, well, what did I do to cause this relationship to not happen anymore? And I think psychology is meant to have you do that further exploration. And if you're just simply throwing around he's a narcissist, this person is gaslighting me, and using it to shut down that conversation, that's a big deal and the antithesis of what psychology is supposed to be.
Right. Like the whole gaslighting thing is a funny one lately because there is a difference between somebody telling you, like, for example, look at memory and how much somebody telling you what happened is really displayed a lot as a gaslighting thing. However, what have we talked about a lot on the show? Memory is inherently flawed. Neuroscience and psychology confirm this, and even individuals of like going back to a diary you wrote in high school and being like, whoa, I was so sure that was not how it happened and it being like, yeah, that's memory. So it's not always gaslighting for somebody to remember something different. It's actually important for you to hear those different versions so you can maybe try to keep the truth somewhat the truth.
Reminds me of the time I worked at a gas station and got robbed. Guy, got the money. He only had a BB gun at the time. I knew it was a BB gun because I had, my cousin had a similar one, but, I'm not even taking a BB shot for a company, So he got that, ran out into his truck and drove away really fast. And I ran outside. This was when I was working third shift at a gas station, and swore up and down that the truck he had was mostly white with some black trim. It's what I told the police officers. They ended up finding the person, bringing his truck into the police station, and they had brought me to the police station to use one of their tools, I guess, to help come up with a face. I guess it was they didn't. In Grand Rapids, they didn't have somebody that just drew a face of what the suspect was supposed to be. They used computer stuff. But I saw the truck, and it was a white truck with red trim. I swore at the time when it happened, it was black. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny how that happened. And if you watch any of like the true crime stuff that goes on and how sometimes people can be totally persuaded, like there's a famous case of, I almost want to say, let's see, maybe it was Emmett Till or no, Ronald Cotton. I don't know. It's happened before, but basically they will get the victim of, say, a rape where it's like, oh my gosh, you were right here. They were right at your face. You should definitely be able to tell us it is this person. And it famously will be a black person that they have talked this woman into fingering, and then later DNA evidence will not only exonerate them but prove that it was a totally different white dude that did it. Like, memory is not only flawed, it is editable. And sometimes you don't even know somebody is editing that. So having like that respected relationship with memory is kind of important. So I will say now there is a difference between somebody saying, "Oh, I remember it differently," and somebody telling you, "I'm sorry, you remember it wrong." Now that is a gaslighting term. That, like, my biological mother did this to me somewhat recently, where she actually said, "Well, I'm sorry, you remembered that wrong." And I'm like, "Oh my gosh, how do you take from the page exactly from the page of what not to say?" What not to say when you're trying to convince your kid that you're not a gaslighter. That's a sentence. Don't say that. Don't say you remembered it wrong when your memory is just as fudging fallible, if not more so because of age. And I think that's like some of the major disconnect in our generations is that right there. Like the idea, because those concepts were not understood or around. So a lot of our prior generation was your memory is all you can trust. So understand that some of the divide that's happening in our real life, like disconnect between our older generation, is that raising. So it's a hard one because you go right back to saying that that's not true. That's a deep identity cut, right? Like that your own memory that you were told is the only thing you can really trust for your whole life is now, oops, that's fallible too. I could understand having a hard time swallowing that. But anyway, I guess as we wrap this up, I have a little bit of a spiel I'm just going to read through just to kind of, if it was a too long, didn't read, and you're skipping right here to the end, I think I can summarize it quickly for us.
All right, let's do it.
Okay, so the landing and where we actually are. So, the history of psychology is a field that started as philosophy, became experimental science, made some embarrassing mistakes, produced some genuinely brilliant thinkers who also had significant blind spots themselves, but then they course corrected and is now doing some of the most sophisticated research on human behavior ever attempted. It is not an infant, it is not infallible, it is actively self correcting, and that's what science is actually supposed to do. The right relationship with psychology is informed skepticism, which is the same way you approach medicine, nutrition, and economics. What's replicated? What's replicable? What are the effect sizes? Who funded the study? Always important to ask. Be especially skeptical of anything primarily circulating on social media rather than peer reviewed journals. Use the tools. Don't treat any single framework as gospel. Jung himself said, dogma has no place in science.
Yeah, healthy skepticism beats cynical dismissal any day.
Exactly. And then just to go one shade deeper into Carl Rogers, who's one of the founders of humanistic psychology, he put the whole point of this field as simply as it ever could. And there's the quote: "The curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change." And that's the through line from Wundt's lab to Jung's shadow work to modern cognitive behavioral therapy. Not more diagnosis, not better labels, but actually understanding yourself and others with enough nuance and compassion to do something about it, right? It's the idea of approaching yourself with curiosity, not condemnation. But you need to actually have that genuine curiosity that's going to not judge yourself so hard that you trip your own identity thread and aren't able to change. Because, damn it, can't we all agree that all of us kind of want to be better versions of ourselves? And that might not be a bad thing. Like that, if we all just focused on our own shadow shit and stopped trying to point out other people and what they're doing wrong, that the world might actually be a better place.
And you say that, and I could have easily pictured Mister Rogers saying that during his show. Like a lot of what he talked about on his show was about emotional growth, well being, and all that stuff. And yeah, I mean, if the moment you can picture yourself as a fallible human being who is prone to mistakes, then the easier it's going to be for you to work towards making those changes to help everybody else, except for my narcissistic ex. Ha ha ha.
And science, your narcissistic ex is emotionally stupid.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's what's funny is like this even comes full circle. This is one of my favorite topics to get on. Of when I hear people say like that, basically psychology or science is somehow in disagreement with the Bible, because the Bible actually had the whole ancient wisdom on this too. Like for those that don't know, that I do actually run my page, the Reverend Tracy, and this is some of the stuff that I'm trying to cover is kind of that intersection of the faiths and psychology. And I almost make the argument that what is psychology other than the religion of my secular, my atheist, and my agnostic brothers and sisters, because they seem to respect what the science says. And I think they all kind of prove each other. And the whole like self reflective and judging yourself is so clearly in the Bible, by the way. Like, there are literally dozens of verses talking about how it is so important to not judge other people and to actually look inward at yourself and be self corrective. Like, there are more about that than anything that even wafts towards homosexuality, by the way. But yet, that's the thing we're going to ignore, that one. You wonder why people think maybe there's a lot of hypocrisy going on in the teaching.
Just a bit. Yeah.
Right, but there's this whole concept of, don't judge the speck in somebody's eye until you remove the plank in your own. Like, there's a lot of argument. Judge not, lest ye be judged by the same measure. Like, this is like essentially laying out these early projection terms and like the importance of working on yourself and not other people. Like, don't judge other people's servants. The actions of another servants is another line that's famously thrown out there. So, there's a lot in there that actually backs what psychology is now able to apply studies to and prove. So, therefore, in the Reverend Tracy's world, psychology has actually been around since Jesus, arguably. That is my funny personal belief. I'm not saying that you have to follow that with me, but I think it goes back since before we were able to do the actual studies. Kind of like hand washing came more of just watching how things played out. Eating and not eating certain things was about how people got sick or died from it. Like, so really, it's just early science when it was observed. It was before we had the tools to look at it as teeny tiny as we could, before we had literal microscopic ability into things we observed.
Yeah, I mean, you don't like, as an atheist myself, like I would be foolish if I tried to make fun of people that did have religious beliefs. Like I don't read Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris because of the fact that those are two noted atheist thinkers that are out there. But I don't like reading their stuff anymore just because of how dismissive and just condescending they are towards people with religious beliefs. I mean, they are basically doing the atheist version of what they accuse like evangelical Christians of doing to atheist people. Because like the beauty of our country, especially, is that we have the ability to have whatever religious beliefs we want without the government stepping in. Or lack thereof. And I fully support that. But like, if we find that there are ways that we can bring this together and talk about the commonality between science and religious stuff, then it's going to be easier for the average person to be able to converse with somebody else. There's no othering anybody here in this particular case.
Right. And I guess that's where it's like, I like to bring up that even as an atheist or agnostic, you should be able to at least respect the book on the level of it was written down and handed down knowledge. Like, if you can even take away, I mean, the fact that we've long used parable across many cultures to teach lessons, like, it could be easily argued that Adam and Eve and the snake was not meant to be, that that's literally what happened, but is perhaps a parable. That is a likely way of taking that book. And if you strip away some of the parableness of it and look at it as like, oh, okay, well, shellfish probably killed a lot of people before we figured out some people were allergic to it, right? So maybe that's why that was literally demonized in the Old Testaments, right? So if you can look at it as a logical book that was written and that ultimately its goal was to spread knowledge on how things work. Like, hey, if you want to make a baby, it's got to be a P and a V. You're not going to make a baby with a sheep. You're not going to make a baby like any other way. It's just not going to happen. And that was actually very important back then. And so, like, when you realize it's kind of early sex ed, it was what they had to work with, right? So, I mean, that's where it's like I can take those books at a logical level, even if you don't believe they were God inspired. It was at the very base minimum trying to share information that was based on observed experience, which is early science.
And there are nuggets in there. I mean, you mentioned some of the stuff that Jesus talked about. I mean, like, treat your neighbor as you want yourself to be treated. If only more people lived by that philosophy today.
Yeah, there's a lot of psychological backing to what was trying to be said. Even the saying, like the talking to people, like letting your worries go. There is actual psychology behind that, right? Like talk therapy. Like, I think that was kind of some of the point of the person that was just in the box, so that you didn't feel judged by anybody other than God. And then you had like kind of a cool solution at the end, right? Like, if you really want to kind of take that as early talk therapy, doesn't it make more sense now? Like, the whole letting it go, letting the things you feel guilty or bad about go and talk about them, like that could actually be good for you. So, and I'm not saying you have to take all of it. I understand, like, saying listen to the Bible can be a very triggering statement for some. However, I do want to kind of point out one thing, is that judging any group based on their religion, their race, their etceteras is still going to be considered bigotry if it's inherently negative and you're using that one thing about them to dehumanize them. And
Well,
that's
and,
where it's
and
like, yeah, I don't mind visiting churches because I want to not judge any book by its cover, because is that not some of the point of even what those of us in the queer community have please been asking for?
yeah, and like the point I was going to make too, like, just about the treating your neighbor as yourself. Like, think of how many people are quick to go on social media to rip into a celebrity for doing something bad when try to flip it and think about it. If you were in their shoes, how would you like it if the worst thing you ever did was broadcast to the world? You wouldn't feel good about that.
Right.
You would want people to sit back and think, hey, listen to the whole story and not just the initial thing that comes out. But when it happens to somebody else, which again, I'm not trying to excuse people that do bad things, but that doesn't necessarily make them a completely evil human being for doing a bad thing. Now, people, when they do bad things, there should be repercussions and all that stuff. They shouldn't immediately be forgiven, blah, blah, blah. More people. I mean, as an atheist, there is some wisdom in the Bible. You would be foolish to say that, and if I had read the Quran, I'm sure I could find some wisdom in the Quran. I could find wisdom in Buddhist teachings. I can find wisdom in, Wiccan teachings, if you want to go that route. To be able to completely dismiss, somebody's religious beliefs is just stupid. And on the flip side, for people that want to dismiss like atheist beliefs or psychology because you feel it goes against your religious beliefs, like examine that. Why are you so virulently against it?
Right. And sometimes it is because it's hard to admit where we were wrong before. I feel like that is something that I've even had personal friends tell me they really appreciate me is I will admit where I've grown as a person. I will admit that I used to think it was horrific that they took homosexuality out of being diagnosed in the DSM. I'm man enough to admit that that was something I believed for a while, but I don't anymore. And I think it's super important that when somebody says, I'm done believing something, that instead of focusing on, well, you did believe it, therefore you're a terrible human being, or they are simply a product of the home they were raised in. And like started to challenge that. And if we don't give people a place to land when they change their mind. However, I do think it means we need to be better about addressing where we changed our mind, right? And that's even like the tongue in cheek thing that I feel about the church as a whole is when you have had damaging messages that have excluded people and made your congregation feel like they should gatekeep and keep certain people out of the church. I do think you owe it to that group to own that that happened and to address it. And I think that is the biggest divide because it's interesting because there are more people going back to church like the younger generation, but they're kind of finding it interesting to try to make the fit, right? Because a lot of the younger generation is more embracing of the queer community and transgender and etc., which is something that the church still very much seems to struggle with accepting. Right. And that's something that even bleeds into it's like, yes, I've restarted the Reverend Tracy, and there's like, I do try to address some of these, and I'm doing some that are as response to some of the sermons that I'm hearing as I'm exploring churches in my life, because I want to address my own religious trauma. And you don't really do that necessarily without somehow getting involved in it again. So this is my path right now, I guess. And yeah, I think that's like one of the things is I think they really do have to address the damage that's been done. And I don't think they're at that point of doing that. So I'm curious to see how the current social experiment is going to play out with the numbers of the young who are interested in exploring religion, but are still kind of getting to this point where it's like, okay, but then what about these topics?
Well, that will be for a future episode.
Oh, quite potentially. I think that would be a cool one to get into, but who knows? Maybe that can feed into some of the nerdy bits. If there's interested, I can do shorter things because I don't want people to think this is turning into a overtly religious thing. But I don't think I keep it a secret that when I'm working on something within myself, obviously I'm going to talk about it a little bit more. And that's been kind of the interesting journey since moving to a very, very Christian dense area of like, you know what? Why don't I check out the churches recently and just see what they're up to these days? Because I hadn't gone to any in like a decade. But when I realized I was kind of harboring some bigotry, because that's what happened was the Mr. Reverend and I were out at breakfast somewhere, and he said he could just feel my body language change when the two gentlemen behind me were just having a conversation about their Bible study. And I realized, like, wow, if I'm reacting that poorly to somebody just having a conversation in my vicinity, not even to me, shadow work, right? It kind of like, so basically, guys, there's a cool example of working through it. Of if you're reacting that violently against somebody just existing around you and talking about something, maybe address that as much as you would want them to address that you wearing your Pride Progress pin and all of your rainbows and dressing to your comfort, that you would want them to address it if it made them feel angry of you existing in your being, right? Like maybe that's part of where we bring this pendulum center is since that does seem to be a common topic that divides in psychology versus, people being kind of against what's accepted in psychology right now, is that maybe we need to have that respect for each other. And that's where some of
Yes.
that pendulum coming to the center can start.
Yeah, because there are going to be things you're going to agree to disagree with people, and also it is possible that there are going to be people that you don't want in your circle in any way, shape, or form, and that is okay. But we're not going to live in a society to where those people that you disagree with are somehow going to go away.
Right,
You
that's
got to
rarely
learn to
how
live with them.
problems get solved. Like, the only people
Yeah.
that solve things by trying to make them go away have been famously on the wrong side of history for it. Hitler. Like, you don't just make people go away, right? Like, with bad. We actually don't want that. So, I guess that's part of it is, if you find that you react poorly to, I get the Trump hat being maybe a thing. Granted, I had a conversation with somebody who was very uncomfortable at first with my pride pin, probably just as uncomfortable as I was about his Trump 2024 hat, and had a totally respectable interaction. We talked about politics, literally none, but I think it is important to treat people like humans no matter what they're wearing. Because if you're going to justify judging somebody's whole being based off of the one thing that they are wearing or doing, I don't think it makes it any better than the things that we are saying we have been against in the queer community. That you're going to judge me as a dirty or bad person because I prefer to present more masculine. Like that's something that I feel like we've been screaming from the rooftops, and unfortunately is part of the overcorrection culture, and where I could see this really swinging the pendulum back in the wrong direction is when you justify dehumanizing somebody because you were dehumanized. I don't think that is going to put us on a good path for correcting it properly. So that's psychology, folks.
The entire history. We thank you for this lecture.
Oh no, like I said, I find it so fascinating. I hope you guys did too. I'll try not to do too many where it's just me on a pedestal talking nonstop on something. But with History Month and like the reopening of the Reverend Tracy page where I am trying to tie psychology and saying that it is related to the ancient text, so these things have been proven for a while, it just seemed too perfect. So thank you for bearing with me. I'm sure we'll have some cool quotes to pull and maybe even some cool classroom shareables, which have been a fun add to the Facebook page for anybody who follows our Instagram or Facebook.
Well, I gotta say, I've enjoyed it as well because, I think one critique I have of myself when it comes as the ringleader of this whole experience is the fact that I've been kind of the one leading things 99% of the time, and it's nice being able to not lead, and so I thank you for this, and I hope we have a lot more of this going forward.
Yeah, and I mean, I found the new formats incredibly fun. I'm learning about new biases that I had no idea about, and cool little side stories about some of my favorite names in psychology. That was kind of fun too. So, as long as we're learning, and hopefully I made it at least palatable on a subject that people barely want to sit through Psych 101 in college for. But I think if they actually hit some of this stuff better, it would be more interesting to people. But so yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed a Reverend T style, just nerding out about something. Sorry, it couldn't be more conversational, but hopefully we made it conversational and enjoyable to listen to.
Well, I certainly enjoyed it. I certainly enjoyed it here. But before we wrap up, do want to give an update here on Professor Aubrey's surgery. Everything went well. Surgery was successful, and her doctor said as of now they are not detecting any cancer. She will have to continue to see the doctor on a regular basis for observation and all that stuff, which is normal. But everything was a success. So sooner rather than later, Professor Aubrey will be back on Friends Talking Nerd.
Nice, nice. And we will figure out how that all aligns too, because I know I've enjoyed being back, and we want to make sure that we're sharing the time and the stuff all together and everything. So
Yes, and also nerdy bits are here. We've already showed our nerdy bits with talking about the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but we are hoping to expand that because there are tons of podcasts with bonus episodes out there, and we've tried that in the past, but I think that in the past, if I have another critique, I think the bonus material wasn't always as focused as it should have been, and I think with the fact that we're trying to utilize more focus in what we talk about on the show here, which I think has definitely helped, in terms of listening and all that stuff. I think, I'm excited about what our future nerdy bits will offer, whether it be in short bits or large bits.
Little bits or big bits, just all of the naughty bits. Come check out our naughty bits. And then, I was throwing it out there with Tim is that this means if it does have interest, there might be a few Reverend Tracy bits about, you can come listen and have some nerdy bits about psychology findings and maybe some of the new studies, for example, because as it applies to parenting, I'm following more parenting stuff lately, and there's some really cool stuff coming out about how you can use tablets and it not be that you're training your kid's brain to be a dumpster fire. That there turns out that there are studies kind of supporting that there are good ways to apply technology to raising kids, new findings in psychology, etc. So if I don't get on it right away, you guys should see those eventually as I try to even out my creative efforts between friends talking nerdy shows. And then also, I do really want to keep up what I have been working on with the Reverend Tracy, as that has been incredibly therapeutic for me. And as I hope it will be therapeutic to other people in the queer community who maybe would like to see the intersection of the faiths, because I am learning about the Quran a bit out of curiosity. And this whole idea is like, well, maybe if somebody is pitching that this is the enemy, maybe there's some knowledge in there that some vested interest people don't want us acknowledging. So why not go ahead and read the things that make you curious? And it's been surprising to some people. I've even extended that curiosity to some of the Mormon church because they have been some of the nicest people since moving here and really easy to have conversations with. So no, I am not joining any church, but I am at least experimenting with them. So some of that can come out in this as well.
Yeah, because you don't want to be like an old friend of mine who has not been a friend of mine for many, many, many years. Like it was someone I used to go to church with. I told him, "Oh, there's a coffee shop. They're going to be showing Monty Python's Life of Brian," and he goes, "Well, that's blasphemous." And at the time, I was going to church, and I was willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. I said, "Why is it blasphemous?" He goes, "Because it is." And that was it. It was just like, oh, fuck you. I'm going to go watch this movie now.
Yeah. Too many generations of believe the person that stands in this stand and says something, which, oh my gosh, we can almost go into a history of some of the religious stuff because I think like pastors have almost like served some of their purpose because that was really more about reading to a demographic of people who couldn't read. It wasn't necessarily like the calling was not necessarily to be interpretive. It was more to literally read words because you had the ability to read to a mass of people who did not have that ability.
Yeah, which is why I believe the Catholic Church was so against, like the printing press being made because it made the Bible accessible to the average person.
Right. Like there were some signs where I get the skepticism, the skepticals coming up with religion because there were some people and still are people who use it to control. But I do think it's another interesting topic. But I'd probably be more in line with new psychology stuff coming out. Might try to pepper some of that in. I promise I'm not going to hit you guys with Sunday sermons as a nerdy bit. I feel like that would be a little too much. But I am going to probably try in psychology. And then, of course, for ancient texts, like back it up. That might be a little bit more when you see a nerdy bit by the Reverend Tracy.
Well, that is good to hear, and I think a good place to stop things for today. So thank you all for listening. Each Monday, we'll have something in this podcast space to entertain your ear holes. Until we meet again, we bid you adieu. Subscribe to Friends Talking Nerdy
on YouTube Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify,
or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Bye, friends.